Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. If we'll go ahead and take our seats, we'll get started in just a moment. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Pete Crane, Vice President of Education and Access here at the National. It is on. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the National World War II Museum's Pearl Harbor 80th Anniversary Commemoration Ceremony. We'd like to start today as we remember one of the most defining moments of the 20th century with a moment of contemplation. I'm pleased to welcome Commander Eric Young to begin our ceremony with an invocation.
I invite you to stand as you are able and remain standing for the marching on of the colors. Let us pray. Almighty and merciful Creator, we come before you today to remember, to honor, and to teach. We gather in both celebration and mourning. We celebrate the freedom you have graced us with in this great country, and yet we mourn the lives of those who have been lost protecting that freedom and this land. We remember. We take now a moment of silence to lift up to you our shipmates, our wingmen, and our trenchmates who have given their fullest measure of devotion to our country in order to protect each other and our way of life. We honor. We thank you for our beloved military and all the men and women who serve at our side throughout time, those who've served it in the past, those who stand the watch now, and those who will answer the call to serve it when we have completed our mission. As we have prayed in days past, keep all who answer our country's call safe from all harm. And we teach. We ask that you make it clear to the generations that follow that we are first and foremost an instrument of your peace, Holy God. And when those of this world will not have that peace and will trample their neighbor underfoot out of malice, greed, and hatred, may these new generations learn that we are to be an instrument of your justice, to stand up for those who have not the power to act on their own behalf. As those whom we remember and honor today teach us that freedom isn't free, may we also learn that it is the most noble of goals of our military to ensure that all people everywhere are indeed free. Holy Creator, as we do our part to honor those who 80 years ago today died or were wounded in the surprise attack on our base at Pearl Harbor, help us to remember, help us to honor, and help us to teach and to learn. We do this as a nation so that in our actions, others may see your goodwill for all life on earth and live in peace, that none who come after us will ever need experience again a day that will live in infamy. These things we all pray. Amen.
Thank you, Commander Young, for your inspiring message of reflection and remembrance. Color Sergeant, present our nation's colors.
Oh, say, can you But so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Color Sergeant, retire the colors. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. Thank you for joining us today on the 80th anniversary of the day that will live in infamy. As we remember the thousands of Americans who tragically lost their lives in the Pearl Harbor attack, while also paying tribute to the World War II generation who defended our country and helped secure the peace and democracy that we enjoy today. In keeping with our time-honored tradition here at the World War II Museum, I'd like to recognize all World War II veterans, home front workers, and Holocaust survivors joining us in person or virtually online today. Please stand or wave to be recognized. We have two special with us today. I would also like to take a quick moment to recognize all other veterans who are with us today. If you could also stand or wave to be recognized, all veterans. Thank you for joining us today. I'd like to give a very special welcome to Pearl Harbor survivor Joe Richard of Church Point, Louisiana, who's with us here today. Joe was a shipfitter first class, serving on the tender USS Rigel. He had only been stationed in Pearl Harbor for a handful of months before the December 7, 1941 attack, and helped rescue many of his fellow sailors from the USS Arizona in the aftermath of the attack. Joe, it's an honor to have you here with us today, and thank you for commemorating this important day with us. Your presence makes this extra special. Thank you, Joe. I'd also like to give a special welcome to Arlene Gaither, a home front worker who traveled to the museum today all the way from Georgia through the generosity of the Gary Sinise Foundation to join us today. Thank you for joining us, Arlene. Thank you both for joining us. It's an honor to pay tribute to you and your service every day here at your World War II Museum. We're also joined today by Rick Carraway, the past national president of the Sons and Daughters of Pearl Harbor Survivors. Rick's been a long-time friend of the museum, helping to organize our Soaring Valor trips, as well as partnering on past events. Thank you for all your work the work you do to carry on the legacy of your father and all other Pearl Harbor survivors. I also would like to offer a very special welcome to our current and past members of the museum's Board of Trustees in attendance or viewing from home today, and I know so many are. Thank you for your leadership and commitment that has made this museum a world-class institution. We also have some of our Patriot Circle and Charter members in attendance today. Your ongoing support makes the programs like this possible, and it's a pleasure to have you with us. Today, we're also joined by two special guests who will provide remarks later on in the program. Dr. Rich Frank, internationally renowned expert on the war and Pacific and one of our presidential counselors, and Michael Ward, accomplished author and son of Pearl Harbor survival Harold Ward. To continue our ceremony, I'd like to turn the program over to the museum's president and CEO, Stephen Watson.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Pete. And I would like to, again, recognize and thank Mr. Richard for being here with us today on this most important day. Thank you for your service, and thank you for bringing so many of your friends and family with you today, Mr. Richard. And also, again, I want to recognize Erline Gaither, who, as Pete said, is from Marietta, Georgia, but worked at Willow Run in Michigan during World War II on B-24s like the one that we have in the back of this building. So thank you and your family for coming to be part of this special day as well. So of course, we're all here today to remember the tragic events of December 7th, 1941, which thrust our nation into a global conflict and as we say around here, set the stage for arguably the biggest story in human history, the story that we tell here every single day at the National World War II Museum. The devastating casualties of the surprise attack and the real shock waves of fear and anger that it sent through our country quickly, and I would say within hours and certainly days, gave way to unity and a strong resolve as Americans of all ages and all backgrounds came together to help secure our victory and, of course, preserve our freedom and democracy. So here we are, 80 years later, as we reflect on these events and the service and sacrifice they inspired in an entire generation of Americans. I think we're also reminded by the urgency of the museum's mission as we have lost so many of this generation. Mr. Richard is one of approximately 200,000 World War II veteran survivors at this point. There were 16.1 million men and women that put on the uniform during World War II. So we are down to the last 1% of those men and women that served, and quickly approaching a time when this museum and our work will take on even greater importance as we continue to make sure this important history is not forgotten. It's a huge responsibility. We say it's a privilege and a huge responsibility, and one that will require the commitment of all of us. You being here today as part of this ceremony is an important part of how you can do your part, but of course, a big responsibility for institutions like the National World War II Museum, but also all the way to dedicated citizens and communities across the country. And I want to highlight one particular community that, as we stand here today, is also undertaking an important commemoration ceremony. And that is the community of Augusta, Wisconsin. I'm sure you've been there. It's a small town of 1,500 that incredibly had 9 residents stationed at Pearl Harbor at the time of the attack. All survived, and they're being remembered and honored today at Augusta's Veterans Memorial Park. And I want to give a special shout out and thanks to John Englesby for his personal commitment to making sure those stories are not forgotten. It was due to his tenacity, his passion for the citizens of his community, that will ensure that those stories are kept alive for future generations. Today's ceremony also, and slate of programs, marks the culmination of our commemoration of the 80th anniversary of the attack at Pearl Harbor. As some of you, I presume, may have seen over the last 80 days, our team has produced and distributed a diverse array of digital content and on-site programs that have really provided a very in-depth exploration of this defining moment in our nation's history. Both before this ceremony right now and later again this afternoon, our distance learning staff, who I think I see at the back of the room, presented the Path to Pearl Harbor, a national electronic field trip which will allow tens of thousands of students from literally thousands of schools across the country to follow student reporters both in Hawaii and right here on our campus in New Orleans as they learn about the events that led to the December 7th attack. We are very fortunate to have with us this morning one of those student reporters, Charlie Jonau. I hope I've pronounced your name right, Charlie. He is here with his classmates from Holy Cross School. They're here, seated right here at the front. I wanted to give them a shout out and thank you for your dedication to ensuring that this critical history is shared with peers of your age. So let's give the students from Holy Cross a shout out right here. Take a small moment of personal privilege to add that I'm proud that my son is a 7th grader at Holy Cross and hopefully will be part of Mr. Arvides' class. I want to also recognize Mr. Arvides, the school teacher at Holy Cross, who teaches a year-long course on World War II, and these students have had the chance almost, I think, once every 2 or 3 weeks to come and visit the museum as part of that program. So thank you, Mr. Arvides, for the great work that you and your colleagues do at Holy Cross. Also, just a few weeks ago, we opened our newest special exhibit. You may have had a chance to see it. It's back in the original building, the Louisiana Memorial Pavilion on the 2nd floor. The exhibit is Infamy, Pearl Harbor Remembered, curated by our own senior curator, Tom Chikansky. And this examines how the attack has been remembered both during the war and since. I hope you'll take a few minutes while you're here today to explore this incredible new exhibit. But in the meantime, I just wanted to say thank you again to all of you for joining us here today, and I will turn the program back over to Colonel Crane. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Now, to provide a historical overview of the events surrounding the attack on Pearl Harbor, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Richard B. Frank. Rich is an internationally recognized leading authority on the Asia-Pacific War. He's published numerous books on the war in the Pacific, which have drawn accolades, including Downfall, The End of the Imperial Japanese Empire. It's been called one of the 6 best books in English on World War II. In addition to his many appearances on television and on radio, he's a consultant for the epic HBO miniseries The Pacific. He's also been a longtime member of the museum's presidential counselors and was our lead consultant for our fantastic exhibit, The Road to Tokyo, Pacific Theater Galleries, here on campus. I hope you have an opportunity to look at his work today. The first volume of his trilogy on the Asia-Pacific War, Tower of Skulls, was published in March 2020, and it was a finalist for the Gilder Lehrman Prize for Military History in 2021. So we've got a great expert to talk to us today. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Rich Frank.
Thank you, Pete, for those words. When I was dressing yesterday, I was about to throw my tie in, and then I had a moment of reflection. The U.S. Navy, its officer corps, started the war at Pearl Harbor in uniforms wearing ties. By the time they got to the decks of the Missouri in September 1945, they were wearing open-neck shirts. So I'm wearing an open-neck shirt today to commemorate that there was an end to these events. A day of triumph, but a day also of commemoration, as is today. In Washington, D.C., on the morning of December 7th, 1941, virtually everyone was up long before word of the attack on Pearl Harbor arrived. Those who took it the morning edition of the Washington Post learned that the just-released annual report of the United States Navy by Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox had become available, and the Post lifted from that report a statement by Secretary of the Navy Knox that read, "The American people can feel fully confident in their Navy," unquote. Elsewhere in the Post, there was a Gallup poll that had just closed out the day before. They'd asked a representative sample of the American people, do you think the U.S. will go to war with Japan in the near future? 52% answered yes, 27% answered no, and 20% answered declined to answer. A Post columnist that morning was quoted as saying, quote, "At the moment this is written, we are extremely close to war with Japan," unquote. So one of the most, I think, misunderstood facts about the attack was not that war with Japan arrived as a total surprise to the American people. It was the location and the circumstances of the attack that exploded as a stunning and enraging surprise. A phone call at 1:40 p.m. reached the White House with the first news of the attack. This was about 25 minutes after the first bomb had fallen in Hawaii. The White House released the official account, made an announcement about the attack at 2:42 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and that rippled across the country to the West Coast. The news bulletins primarily reached Americans via their home and car radios. Afterwards, virtually everyone would remember where and how they learned of this history-changing news. In the moment, however, most Americans, including those who deemed themselves well-informed, could not immediately locate Pearl Harbor, and they were not alone. At Adolf Hitler's headquarters, no one knew where Pearl Harbor was either. The news reached the stadium where the Washington Redskins football team was playing the Philadelphia Eagles. The Washington team won. The next day in the coverage of the Washington Post included the subheadline, quote, "Japan kicks off," unquote. The Japanese fleet, the Kido Butai, as they called it, launched two waves of attack totaling 350 aircraft. At the time they took off, the 6 Japanese aircraft carriers were steering into very heavy seas. The flight decks rolled and pitched so badly that in peacetime, no operations would have been attempted. But the massive cavalcade of Japanese offensives we were soon to learn about was timed around the Pearl Harbor strike, except one. The very first blow of Japan's expansion of the war landed on the Malayan Peninsula a few hours before the attack on Pearl Harbor, but the Japanese correctly calculated that word of that event could not possibly have reached the U.S. before their planes appeared over Pearl Harbor. Because the Japanese strikes arrived from the north, when they split up to attack specific targets, the planes detailed to attack American airfields faced a much shorter distance to fly, and consequently the very first bombs to fall fell on air installations, not on ships in the harbor. The U.S. forces on Oahu had gained 2 important tactical warnings of the attack. First, the destroyer Ward, on sentry duty outside the entrance to Pearl Harbor, had attacked and sunk one of 5 Japanese midget submarines seeking to penetrate the harbor. The Ward radioed an urgent message of her encounter, but the duty officer of the Pacific Fleet failed to issue a jumble alert. Shortly afterwards, 2 U.S. Army privates were operating a radar set, and they observed on the oscilloscope of that set the largest blip they had ever beheld. This represented returns from some of the Japanese first attack wave. They called the report into the Air Control Center. This operation had shut down officially per the grossly defective stance ordered by the Army commander, Lieutenant General Walter Short, despite a war warning message he'd received on 27 November. No regular control officer was present, but a fighter pilot was lingering there after watch, acting merely as an observer for training. He had heard of a flight of inbound American B-17s coming from the West Coast and decided that the radar contact must be with those planes. By a great stroke of luck for the Japanese, the tracks of the 2 aircraft formations were very close together. Thus, the Army also failed to react to the tactical warning with an alert. Had either of these tactical warnings prompted an alert, there would have been no time for the ships to get to sea, but there would have been time for the ships to go to general quarters, prepare their watertight security, and muster their anti-aircraft crews. We can say that had there been a sufficient alert, there probably would have been significantly greater amounts of resistance to the Japanese attack and less U.S. damage, but we can't say exactly how much. None of the three Pacific Fleet carriers were then in harbor. The Saratoga was undergoing routine maintenance on the West Coast. The Enterprise and the Lexington had been dispatched just a few days earlier in accordance with discretionary orders from Washington to move air reinforcements to Wake and Midway Islands, respectively. The Enterprise, in fact, should have arrived that morning, just a few hours before the attack waves arrived, but she ran into heavy seas, was delayed, and very fortunately had not reached Pearl Harbor before the attack. Now, as I indicated, the first bombs fell on American air installations approximately 0748. A seldom noted fact is of the 350 Japanese attack aircraft in the two waves, no less than 183, or more than half, actually went to attack airfields, not ships in harbor. The first Japanese weapon to hit in Pearl Harbor was, in fact, a bomb aimed at Ford Island in the center of the harbor. Immediately behind came the Japanese torpedo bombers. They had specially modified weapons to launch in shallow waters of Pearl Harbor that sank 3 of the 5 American battleships sunk that day. Then came flights of Japanese level bombers carrying modified naval shells to drop from high altitude. These were intended to pierce the heavy armored decks of battleships, and one of these detonated the forward magazine of the battleship Arizona. She blew up in a stunning explosion that killed most of her crew. The Japanese airmen were, however, stunned by the speed with which American sailors mustered to put up the most intense anti-aircraft fire they had ever seen. This fire, plus the masses of thick smoke and a lowering cloud ceiling, sharply diminished the effectiveness of the Japanese air attacks after about the first 10 minutes. The standard official figures place American total deaths at 2,403. Of this number, some 2,113, or 88%, were sailors or Marines aboard ships. The Japanese architect of the attack, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, had vehemently opposed Japan going to war with the U.S. When his superiors decided on that path, Yamamoto acted, in my belief, really more in desperation, not in confidence in the war. He believed that Japan had no realistic chance to win in a long war because of the enormous economic disparity between the two nations, and he further believed that the Imperial Navy's long-developed plan for a short war was completely ineffectual. He believed the Imperial Navy's, he conceived that the only possible American vulnerability Japan could attack was American willingness to carry on the war. In other words, American will. He believed that if he could successfully strike a blow at Pearl Harbor and a succession of hard blows afterwards, it might be possible to break American morale and secure a negotiated peace before the inevitable defeat of Japan in a long war. But Yamamoto also counted upon a Japanese declaration of war to reach the U.S. before the attack. It did not. The attack without declaration of war enraged the entire American public. This effectively took a negotiated peace end of the war off the table, and further, the U.S. would restore most ships sunk or damaged in the attack back to service. Seldom in history has a nation opened a war with a greater operational and tactical success that proved to be an irredeemable strategic disaster. Thank you.
Thank you, Rich. As fewer World War II veterans remain to tell their stories, it's more important than ever for their legacies to be carried on to the next generation. Today's keynote speaker, Michael Ward, knows this all too well. Michael Ward is the son of Harold Ward, a mess attendant who served on the USS San Francisco at Pearl Harbor and later at Guadalcanal. He's also the author of A Colored Man in Exeter, a book he wrote at the request of his father to share his father's experience in navigating post-war life in New Hampshire. The museum was privileged to be able to capture Harold's experience at Pearl Harbor in 2012, in his own words, through an oral history. That happened 3 years before he passed away. In the following video, you'll see a clip of his oral history, so please direct your attention to the screens.
Hawaii right now might be the island of paradise, but it was a hellhole of creation that day and for a couple, 3 nights.
That morning, the sun was out. It was a beautiful day. And then after the first attack, everything turned black. That day was really dark and everything after the attack, you know.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Started out no different than the rest. You know, it was a Sunday morning, and it was quiet. A lot of ships in the harbor.
At 7:55, they sounded general quarters, all hands man your battle station. There was 5 of us in the pay office, and I ran to this big porthole we had in the pay office and looked out. And when I looked out, I saw the rising sun on this Kate bomber that had just released its first torpedo for our ship. When I saw the rising sun, I hollered out. I said, "The Japs are here."
When the planes peeled away and I could see the big red Japanese insignia, and I knew it was the Japanese right away, and they were bombing Fort Island.
And you could see them. They came in low and slow. His head looked about that big in the cockpit. That's how close they came to Frisco. They just flew right across the bow, heading toward the air station, and the battleships lined up at the moorings.
I could see the torpedo planes coming in and the torpedoes in the water. I could see the Pennsylvania over here in dry dock, and the West Virginia and the Tennessee and ahead of us, and the Nevada behind. Just everybody was getting hit, and it was just a very confused situation.
And just when I slammed this last dog down on this one door, a torpedo hit the next compartment, hit a fuel tank, sprung the door, and I was completely covered with oil. I turned around and I could see water coming down the second deck ladder hatch. And so I went over and climbed up the ladder and went up on the second deck. And when I got up there, water was already waist high. So I jumped into the water and hid behind this big camel that separated the 2 battleships. And some of my shipmates came up with me from the 3rd deck, and they were already in the water or sitting on the hull because the ship had gone over. And that Jap Zero got every one of them.
Shook the ship, and 33,600 ton or something like that. Just shook it like a dog would shake a rat or something, you know. And it blew 110 foot of the bow of the ship off. The Arizona burned for 3.5 days after that. 1 million pounds of ammunition exploded. Aviation gas, fuel oil. Just a horrible day. They lost 1,177 men on the Arizona.
Days after, because it's on patrol, you see body parts. That hurts when you take guys that's only 17, 18, 19 years old. A lot of young kids. As the older I get, those kind of things stands out in my mind.
Well, it's a feeling I can't express. But to know that a lot of your shipmates are still there. When you look at the wall and you can see all the names, well, I knew him. I knew him. Yeah, he was one of my shipmates. It's tough.
No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
So, good morning, folks. I thank and appreciate you all being here. And I'm here at the bequest of my father as much as anyone else. He was an interesting man. So, I was not a writer until just before he died, when he told me he wanted me to write this. So I started writing our family history. I'm on the third of 4 books in a collection called Sketches of Lee, and they capture our experience leaving Brooklyn, New York in 1957. At that time, my dad was on the Jolly Charlie, the USS Charles Rome, a destroyer. And we were in Brooklyn, and my brother and I had gotten beaten up by gang members. I was 3, my brother was 13, and we caught someone looking in the window at my 7-year-old sister at 1 in the afternoon. So we bailed, and we ended up on a dirt road in Lee, New Hampshire, and integrated the town and the school district the same day as Little Rock, Arkansas. And we never told anyone what went on or what we went through, and my dad said he wanted his great-grandchildren to know what we'd lived through and to write it up. So when your dad asks you for a favor 6 weeks before he dies, and you know he's going to die, you kind of do what he asked, you know? So I was asked to come here for the 75th anniversary of the attack. And I have a collection of reminiscences? Yes, of remembrances. But the first thing I would like for you all to do is look up. Americans of the current generation assume victory in any war that we choose to prosecute. On December 8th of 1941, that assumption was not valid. Overhead floats, brown, gray, yellow, red, white, blue, silver, black, orange, clear, swatches, shine or matted, reflected or glow, burnished in mature midday light, overlay aluminum, plexiglass, and steel. Each expands, mates with its brothers, synthesized expressions of aerial war. How will they be illuminated in future light? In the everlasting twilight of defeat? Or in the clear light of a new day as victory? My father was an orphan in the Depression, and he was unwanted and spent his childhood in what can only be described as Dickensian squalor. He was neither adequately fed, clothed, and received no affection. He graduated from Atlantic City Technical High School in 1939, and, reading the recruiting posters, went down and joined the U.S. Navy because he graduated as an electrician's apprentice, and he intended to become an electrician, and with his Navy experience, he'd be an electrician and would have seen the world. There was a different reality in the U.S. Navy then. It was segregated. And after he completed basic training, segregated, he was not a seaman first, even though he had taken the same classes and displayed the same competencies required to become a seaman first. He was unrated personnel, a mess attendant third class. Now, most people don't realize this, but the U.S. Navy, their officer corps, had servants. The servants had originally been Filipinos, but as the war approached and everyone knew it was coming, they said, well, we need some people to replace the Filipinos. Well, we'll get the colored people to do it. So instead of being an electrician's mate, he was shining people's shoes, washing their clothes, cooking their meals, making their beds. I'm not sure that many of us here would stand for that. And he didn't. But as unrated personnel, an employee of the U.S. Navy, he was subject to the UCMJ. And being a rather fractious young man, it's a good way to put it, he let him know that he didn't appreciate it. So he ended up in the exec's office, and the exec says, "Ward, I don't write the policies, but it's my job to enforce them. We both know they're unfair, but neither of us can do a damn thing about it. I'm sorry, but you're just going to have to live through it." In the end, I was deemed unfit to serve meals to the officers and gentlemen of the San Francisco. My new job was cleaning all the heads in officers' country. I didn't care. Anything was better than waiting on those bastards. When the Japanese attack came on December 7th, we were arrogant, unprepared, and we paid for it. But personally, I had no quarrel with the Japanese. I'd never even thought much about them. All I wanted to do was get the hell out of the Navy in June of '42. That morning, I was on watch as a lookout. But my mind was on the baseball game in the afternoon that I just borrowed 50 cents from another sailor so I could go. All of a sudden, these airplanes are making their break right by my station. They were so close, I could look into their cockpits. I could see them moving their hands and making adjustments as they lined up for their attack. And then they straightened out and flew right down Battleship Row. Each pilot knew his designated route and target. Their precision was incredible. It was like watching a movie. Excuse me. I called down to the officer of the deck and said, "We are being attacked by multiple aircraft from the Imperial Japanese Navy." The officer of the deck replied, "Ward, I don't need any more of your crap. When you're off watch, you're restricted to quarters pending a captain's mast." The OOD did not believe him, but a white sailor came down and told him, "We're being attacked." That's how stratified the military was. And when you think about that being a combat situation, today, that wouldn't happen. So they ignored the San Francisco because we were in dry dock. They only went after the active participants. So the entire side of the harbor that my father was on, there were all these ships in various states of disrepair. They were not functional. The Japanese ignored all of them. Some fool came out on the deck with a .45 and started shooting at a Japanese plane. A bunch of guys tackled him and beat the crap out of him. The bosun took him downstairs and put him in the brig so he wouldn't get killed. Now, on my father's end of the ship, there were no weapons, armaments of any kind. They were in the armory on shore. On the other end of the ship, there were some functional guns. But on my dad's end of the ship, there's just this one fool, right? So they took care of that. But the final note here is, I grew up as an orphan without many friends. I stood and watched as the few that I had made in the Navy evaporated. Their ships burned, exploded, and burned some more, and sank. And those guys that did jump into the water, the burning oil got them. It was personal now. The Japanese took from me. The U.S. Navy was no longer my enemy. The Japanese were, and we were at war. Dad retired from the U.S. Navy in 1959 as a Petty Officer First Commissaryman. His World War II interviews are featured at various places throughout the museum. But as an unwanted orphan, my dad had no experience with operating a family. Well, the Navy became his family, and we operated according to Navy rules. As kids, we had shape up every Saturday morning. Our clothes were folded and put away, trash cans emptied, and beds made to U.S. Navy standards. No, he didn't bounce the quarter, but it was close enough. Serious matters were handled around the kitchen table as if we were shipboard. When he looked you in the eye and said, "Do you understand?" woe to you if you answered no. If that was the case, the message might be reinforced physically. And with that spirit, I will introduce the next piece with one of his life lessons. It's one that I learned working in his restaurant at age 11, washing pots. You don't have spare time in the kitchen. There's always something to do. When you're cooking, always wash your dishes and utensils as you go. If the ship goes to general quarters, you have to get to your battle station. You can't be below deck washing dishes. Always be prepared, Michael. Always be prepared. Which leads me to a question which evolved from thinking about this entire experience. Are we ready? Well, we weren't ready at Pearl Harbor, and some of the areas that we weren't ready in, we take for granted now. So for instance, these young fellows from the Holy Cross School, in 1940, 75% of the military enlisted men had not graduated from high school. 41% of the total military of the enlisted servicemen had no high school at all. The officers had all gone to college. You see a problem here? Because if you cannot communicate effectively, you cannot fight. Education became a military priority for the United States after World War II. And gentlemen, you are benefiting from that. Another thing that happened was we have an issue with funding the military. We always seem to have a problem funding the military. The base at Pearl Harbor was upgraded in less than a year to accommodate the fleet, which before that had been at San Pedro, California. It was upgraded by executive order. They were redeployed for 6 weeks, and 6 months later, they were still there. At the time of the attack, the base really was not fully operational. They were missing ships, they were missing equipment. It's similar to if you built a mansion and it looked gorgeous on the outside, you go inside, there's no furniture, there's no coffee maker, and oh, but there's an oven, but you don't know how to use it. That's the simplest way I can put it. So when we look at ourselves now, 80 years later, have we solved that problem? No, we have not. And you can lay it at the feet of your congressman. You cannot fund or maintain a military by running it on continuing resolutions. You have to have a budget. We haven't had a budget in so long, it's ridiculous. So what does this mean? It means that the Marines on the West Coast, off of California, lose a landing craft, 11 men die, drown, because the craft should have been taken out of service. A landing craft is supposed to float. It sank. They kept it in service. They had no replacement. When a carrier comes back from deployment, most of the time, they aren't flying for the last couple of weeks or 2 weeks or so, they don't have the money to pay for the fuel to fly the planes. Are we ready? The gist of this, I guess, is that the military takes money, freedom is not free, and if our government doesn't get back to its business of funding the military, passing budgets, we're always going to have these weird failures. How did that happen? Okay? And the other thing is, we have to make sure that our people are trained. How did the USS John McCain run over a Japanese fishing boat? The analysis was that one sailor said, I really don't know how to do what I'm supposed to do. These are the ship handlers. And the other one said he was afraid of his job. Now, that's a management issue, and it was handled. But when we look at ourselves and say, are we ready, we have to remember hubris is our biggest enemy. We have the stuff, but we have to have the brains and the coordination to make it happen. There is an ending note to the thought or process of sending men into battle. It's something that happened when I was a young boy. Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain, for purple mountains' majesty above thy fruited plain. 4/10 of a mile. The definition of a patriot: a man volunteering in service of his country, accepting inconceivable sacrifices to defend a place not perfect, a place capable of change, a place where effort mattered, a place where one could begin a life, a family, a future. Harold and Virginia Ward. I was 27 years old on a sunny January mid-afternoon in 1980. I walked into the kitchen of my parents' house on Lee Hook Road in Lee, New Hampshire. Dad sat hunched over, stone silent, face drawn tight, elbows on his knees. His gaze was bore-sighted at the kitchen floor 3 feet in front of him. His eyes reflected horrors that had escaped from the vault in his memory that protected him from the past. A glass of Jack Daniels was held with both hands to keep it from spilling. Hey, Dad, how you doing? Not so good, Michael. I'm not right. What's wrong? I don't want to talk about it. His hand shook and he slopped some Jack on the floor. Disgusted with himself. Shit. Dad, you want a towel? No, I'll take care of it. He straightened up slowly and turned, got a towel off the kitchen table, and then he stood, and he looked a lot older than his 68 years. And I looked at him, I was like, what's wrong with him? I couldn't figure it out, so I went into the living room to see my mother. Mom sat on a stool by a bench. She was a viper-like fury, quiet, hissing, and lethal. Did you know him? Who? That asshole who shot himself. No, I knew him, but he wasn't a friend. Why the hell didn't he do it in his own town? Why did he do it here? Several weeks before, Dad had been on night patrol as a Lee policeman when he got the call. A young man had committed suicide at a friend's house. Dad triaged the scene and called for the ambulance to collect the body. Afterwards, he signed off watch. He knew what was coming next. He'd already lived through it in World War II and after. And now that it was here in front of him, he couldn't unsee it. He'd been a sailor in a wartime U.S. Navy that wouldn't let him man a weapon. His duty required him to recover casualties exposed on the open deck of his warship during battle. You can dodge a bullet. You cannot dodge a 6-inch high explosive round or its shrapnel children. His last battle on the USS San Francisco had taken the life of his best friend and almost his as well. Eventually, his body repaired itself. But every November 13th, he went back to a place beyond comprehension, a place where there was no certainty, where nothing he had ever learned applied. It was into this void that he had fallen, but now his memories had escaped the night. Now his memories had escaped the night. They were crushing him in the daytime. That night, Mom's disgust and rage were visceral and focused. Look at him. He's been like that for 3 weeks. He won't even leave the house. He's right back to where he was when he came back from the war 35 years ago, screaming, crying, thrashing nightmares. Eventually, after 10 years, I got it so he could sleep through the night. But every time a piece of shrapnel worked its way out of its body, they'd start up again. Those goddamn wars never end. It was more than 3 months before he returned to his job as a policeman. A couple weeks back when I was 7 years old, I'm making an adjustment for time. In the summer of 1959, I stopped in at my best friend Steve Hendler's house, and I asked his mother about the war effort and how it had affected her. Michael, they had to be stopped. Everyone was afraid they were going to take over the world. After Pearl Harbor, all the men signed up for the draft. It's what you did. She spoke with a quiet intensity. Helmut was a chemist. The government told him where to go. It wasn't like he could have joined the Marines if he wanted to. He came home and told me that he'd been assigned to a top-secret project that would end the war. But then he said, "You need to know, the radiation will make me sterile. We won't be able to have children." We were living in New Jersey, and he was working in a lab in New York City. He couldn't tell me what he was working on, just that it was an incredibly powerful weapon on the edge of known science. He always kissed me goodbye in the morning, because if there was an accident in the lab, I wouldn't be able to see or touch his body because of the radiation. He also told me that if they had an accident in the lab, New York City and the surrounding area would instantaneously cease to exist. The stress on him was incredible. He'd leave before sunrise and come back well after dark. Years of working 14 to 16-hour days, but no matter how late he worked, I had his dinner ready for him when he came home. And every night after dinner, he'd go through the same ritual. He'd get one glass of brandy and stare at the wall and sip on that one glass of brandy until 10 p.m. She paused and spoke about her man with the same steel-edged intensity as Virginia and Irene. It's a steel that I later came to understand and define as patriotism. The Germans and the Japanese had to be stopped. They were going to take over the world and kill or enslave anyone they didn't like. We gave up our dreams of having a family to help save our country and the world. Blanca and Stephen are a blessing. Your dad had terrible experiences in the war, and I know he has nightmares. But for him, it's over. He's not going to die. Helmut was always a quiet man, but the project made him quieter. He helped build a weapon that ended the war. At the same time, it opened Pandora's box. They created a weapon that in the wrong hands could wipe out mankind. He feels so much guilt that he no longer goes to church. He's afraid that God can't forgive him. This haunts him and will for the rest of his life. In the summer of 1959, the definition of patriot was written and paid for by the wives, all living within 4/10 of a mile on a dirt road in Lee, New Hampshire. Population 600. Oh, beautiful for patriots' dreams that see beyond the years. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, for sharing your father's story and reminding us of the debt of gratitude that we owe to him and all others who served during the attack on Pearl Harbor, including, of course, those who paid the ultimate price. In just a moment, Mike will ring the museum's replica of the Liberty Bell 3 times to remember the 2,403 people who lost their lives during the attack on Pearl Harbor. But before that, I'd like to recognize another very special person who joined us during the presentation. I'd like to welcome Mr. Leonard Larkins of the 93rd Engineers who fought in World War II from 1941 to 1945. Leonard was one of the men, the countless engineers, who helped build the Alcan Highway that today is the artery between Alaska and Washington State. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Larkins. Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, will you please rise for the bell ringing and a moment of silence? Thank you. Please be seated. May we never forget the sacrifices made by our service members and civilians 80 years ago. As we conclude today's ceremony, I'd like to again remind everyone to make sure to head over to the Louisiana Memorial Pavilion to view our latest exhibit, Infamy, Pearl Harbor Remembered. Also, please join us again this afternoon here in the U.S. Freedom Pavilion, the Boeing Center, for a slate of programs presented by the museum's Institute for the Study of War and Democracy. At 2:15, Rich Frank will be back on stage to discuss his book, Tower of Skulls, with a book signing to follow. Had to put that plug in, Rich. At 3:45, Pearl Harbor Aftermath will feature a panel of museum historians to discuss the implications of the Pearl Harbor attack on a global scale and on what became the home front that day. And at 5 p.m., we'll hold a reception ahead of our final program of the day with author Christopher Capizzola as he discusses his book, Bound by War, with a book signing to follow. Again, thank you for joining us for our commemoration of the 80th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor, as we look forward to seeing you again soon at the National World War II Museum. Thank you for joining us today.